So the Brazilians have voted, and this man, Jair Bolsonaro, is in the lead. The Brazilians now go to the polls again in 2 weeks' time, but we still don't know much about this man. Earlier today, I asked Martha Reyes of Value Partners what her thoughts were about this man.
He's a right-wing former army captain who is called the Trump of Brazil, or the tropical Trump, because he is known for very controversial comments. He's very hard on crime, and he's very popular because of that. And he has a very orthodox economic advisor who trained at the University of Chicago. So as a result, he's supported by a large part of the investment community. He's also talked about passing pension reform, which is very crucial for Brazil. And he's very popular in the southeast of Brazil, which is the more prosperous part of the country. We've got another candidate who was only recently named by Lula, the former president, as the candidate for the Workers' Party. Lula himself cannot run for elections because he's been convicted of corruption and is in prison for the next 12 years. However, Haddad will be more or less following Lula's instructions, according to himself. And he has a lot of support because during Lula's mandate, he provided a lot of social grants to the northeast part of the country, the poorer part of the country. And so he's very popular among that electoral base. And we should expect that the candidates will become more moderate in their campaigning once we get to the second round, and we'll know the results after October 28th.
So how important is it for the government to pass social security reform?
It is very important for Brazil to pass the pension reform. The current government wasn't able to because it requires constitutional amendment, and that necessitates 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. And the reason it's so important is because Brazil has a gross debt to GDP level of over 80% and rising. Their fiscal deficit is over 7%. And this is largely as a result of pensions. The Brazilian population is aging, and the average pension age is 55, which is far too young.
So there's a need for reform.
There's a need for reform. Over half of the primary fiscal spend is used on pension reform, which crowds out infrastructure and much needed investment spend.
Martha, I understand you were negative about prospects for Brazil.
Yes, John. Earlier in the year, the market rallied quite strongly. It got ahead, the valuations got ahead of fundamentals, and we decided to trim back our position in the first quarter, particularly after we had a downgrade in GDP forecast. The first quarter was very weak, and GDP estimates for the year were halved to 1.5%.
But now you're coming less bearish?
Yes, we are becoming less bearish. There are four reasons why that's the case. The first would be valuations. We think they are more demanding now versus emerging markets. Brazil is trading at a bit of a discount with much punchier earnings growth of 20% and improving free cash flow from corporates. The second reason would be the currency. A large part of the underperformance of Brazil this year has been because of the currency, and that's to do with the global environment as much as the local environment, and we think a lot of the risk premium is already embedded.
Right.
The third reason would be economic growth. After a very disappointing start, we're finally seeing an improvement, and in this 2019 we do expect GDP growth to be over 2%. And the final reason would be the elections. We're coming to the end of the political uncertainty. The two candidates that are ahead in the polls are now consolidating, and neither seems to be the extreme scenario that the market had been concerned about earlier in this year.
So can you put this all into context of the global position with the Sino-American trade wars, Turkey, and issues like that? What does it mean for Brazil?
Yes, well, that's all very important for Brazil. We don't pretend to try and call the trade war when that will end. It's impossible to say, but we do think the current tariffs and even the additional $270 billion worth of tariffs that Trump has threatened China with, they're already well flagged and discounted in valuations. So unless we see a very distressed scenario, we think that's in the price. And of course there are always risks. Turkey is still a concern. The government hasn't addressed the looming NPL issue for the banks. and a strengthening US dollar could also be negative. On the other hand, if we see China loosening fiscal conditions, that will certainly be a tailwind for emerging markets, particularly commodity-linked countries like Brazil.
And just to finally ask you about Latin America more generally, is there any contagion from Brazil into the rest of Latin America?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, we have seen it in the case of Argentina. And if Brazil were to have a very negative outcome, it would certainly be an additional risk. But that is not our base case scenario.
Arthur Reyes, Value Partners, thank you very much.